In this lecture, we're going to talk about how and why Europeans undertook voyages of expansion and what the results of those voyages were. Europeans undertook voyages of expansion in order to spread Christianity and to expand their wealth. By the mid-15th century, European population was growing quickly after recovering from the Black Death. The 1457 conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire convinced many Europeans to try and go around Ottoman and Safavid empires to trade directly with India and China. The success of the Reconquista, that is the reconquest of Spain from the Abbasid Empire by the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, led to a religious fervor, a belief that Spanish destiny was to spread Catholic Christianity to the world. The success of the Reconquista also led to a desire and even a need for the discovery of new wealth to compete in warring Europe. And of course, Renaissance culture encouraged a curiosity about the world. Europe in this period was a divided continent. Spain was one of several powers attempting to create a Europe-wide empire. Centralization of European governments increased power and made money for voyages available, while also creating a need for the wealth that voyages promised. European technology also enabled expansion. In 1410, Arab scholars had reintroduced to Europe Ptolemy's geography, and then Europeans gained the magnetic compass, the astrolabe, and learned shipbuilding. In the 15th century, Portugal developed the caravel, a small, light, three-masted sailing vessel that was capable of sailing in the North Atlantic. And Europeans also used weaponry on board their ships. They developed shipboard cannon because Europe was in the midst of so much warfare that European traders even needed to protect themselves. But it's important to recognize that all of this technology of Europeans was contingent. Gunpowder had been invented in China, as had the compass and sternpost rudder. The astrolabe was invented by Arab traders in the Indian Ocean trade. Columbus carried with him the diaries of Marco Polo, and his maps came from Ptolemy, who was an ancient African intellectual, and possibly Marco Polo. In other words, Europeans' ability to cross the Atlantic and to circumnavigate Africa was contingent on prior inventions from participants elsewhere in the world as part of the Indian Ocean trade. Well, let's look at Portugal. Portugal was small and blocked from access to Europe by Spain. They learned to sail the Atlantic to trade with Europe and then extended that knowledge southward to Western Africa. Prince Henry, who lived from 1394 to 1460, sponsored consolidation of navigation knowledge, charts, and encouraged exploration in search of trade routes. By 1415, the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta in northern Morocco was the beginning of European overseas expansion, and by 1443, Portugal had founded their first commercial settlement in North Africa at a place called Arguin. By 1487, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and by 1498, Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Indian Ocean to trade for spices in Calicut, and returned with 16,000% profit, even after losing half his ships and men. Lisbon thus became the entrance point for Asian goods into Europe, and the Portuguese established trading posts throughout Southeast Asia and India. Columbus was Genoese. An accomplished seafarer and mapmaker, Columbus was very religious and agreed completely with the idea that Christianity should be carried to the places in the world where it did not yet exist. The need for financing his idea to travel to China via the Atlantic Ocean led him to approach Portugal and eventually Spain twice before King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile agreed to finance his voyage. They agreed to make him viceroy over any territory he discovered and allow him to keep 10% of all the wealth he brought back. Columbus believed when he arrived that he had found some small islands off the coast of Japan. He described the natives of the Bahamas as good-looking, peaceful, primitive, and easy to enslave. He called them Indians because he believed he had found the Indies, the Indian Ocean trade area he had been looking for. We now know these natives were the Taino, and he had landed on what is today Haiti or the Dominican Republic, the island of Hispaniola. He noted that some of the Taino wore gold jewelry, and they assured him that there was more gold. He and his men were never able to find a mine or a source for the gold, however. In their search, though, they kidnapped, killed, and maimed thousands of Taino as they threatened them to get them to tell of a source of gold that did not exist. Eventually, Columbus brought back Spanish settlers who turned the island of Hispaniola into their private estates and forced the Taino to work as slaves on their plantations, where they grew sugar and eventually tobacco. Agriculture became the economic engine, but the Spanish realized there was no gold. Here are the maps of some later explorers. We have Magellan, who circumnavigated the globe between 1519 and 1522. We have Pedro de Cabral. We have Amerigo Vespucci. All kinds of different explorers from different states in Europe followed after the Spanish. In 1519, the Spanish governor of Cuba sent an expedition to the mainland of the Americas under Hernan Cortés. Cortés and his men eventually met up with the Mexica, or the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs controlled a large empire from their capital city on a lake under what is now Mexico City. Cortés noticed the wealth of the Aztecs and broke the rules of his mission by setting up a settlement near Tenochtitlan. Eventually, Cortés attacked Tenochtitlan, and though his force was smaller, his weapons were more powerful, and by chance, the Spaniards killed the Aztec ruler. The Spanish allied with other native groups who had been conquered by the Mexica and eventually defeated them and wrecked Tenochtitlan, searching for loot. As is clear from the pictures in this slide, the effect of European conquest on Native Americans was devastating. In an event known to historians today as the Great Dying, the Native American population declined drastically. Estimates are that the population declined by 95% within the first 100 years after contact. As you can see from the chart above, which concerns only Mexico, population declined from a high of probably around 25 million to a low of less than 2.5 million from 1518 to 1593. That decline was a result of multiple factors. First, Europeans conquered territory by force if necessary, and regularly used deadly force to require Native Americans to work in their mines or fields, and to put down revolts. The forced labor also took many Native Americans away from the traditional farming and gathering done to support their families, which led to mass starvation. Colonists were also known to force Native Americans to work by killing their family members. Last, but probably the biggest impact, Europeans brought with them diseases to which they had immunity or resistance, but which Native American populations had never encountered. Smallpox, perhaps the biggest killer of these, destroyed whole societies. This may have been unintentional, although in at least one case on the island of Manhattan it was clearly intentional. But the spreading of disease had the effect of genocide on Native Americans. The Columbian Exchange is the name historians give to the overall exchange, intentional and unintentional, of goods, plants, animals, people, diseases, and other living organisms between the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian world after the arrival of European explorers and colonists. This includes food supplies, but it also includes the movement of diseases from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. The transatlantic triangular trade is the name given to the trade pathways created after the New World was linked to the Afro-Eurasian trade world. From the Americas came raw materials and food. Europe turned that food into manufactured goods, including textiles, beads, and many other things, then exported some of those goods to Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves who were taken to the Americas to produce the raw materials that would go back to Europe. And there were social and cultural effects of conquest as well. Europeans saw Africans and Native Americans as members of inferior cultures. Much of this was due to lack of Christianity and cultural difference. In the case of Africans, the business of slavery eventually worked its way into culture, leading to perceptions of Africans as fundamentally different and inferior to Europeans. The slavers encouraged this view in order to maintain business by minimizing sympathy with enslaved Africans. Native Americans were both non-Christian and frequently defeated by Europeans. Their status as conquered and subjects for conversion led to a sense that they were there for Europeans to use as they saw fit. Eventually, during the scientific revolution, superficial observations of human culture led to classification based on skin color, clothing, housing, and supposed political and economic sophistication. Although these observations were frequently made with no scientific basis and little to no understanding of the geographical and cultural contexts of the behaviors and physical traits measured, they were considered scientific at the time and led to the classification of different human communities in a hierarchy, with Europeans at the top, as European scientists assumed their position to be the highest of the human condition. Thus, the idea of race is based on unscientific observations conducted in the name of science during the scientific revolution. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation led to competition for the truth between the two religions. Discovery of people in the Americas with radically different cultures and ways of life, and the fact that America was unknown to Europeans at all until Columbus suggested there was more to learn. This led to an intellectual position called skepticism, in which it was impossible to imagine that the complete truth about anything could be known with certainty. Skeptics tended to believe that there was always more to learn about any subject and did not accept simple explanations. Shakespeare, Father Bartolomeo de las Casas, and Michel de Montaigne were such skeptics. Montaigne invented a method of writing, essays, that encouraged readers and encouraged thinking and joining in on the intellectual debate. He guessed that Europeans were looking at the world from an assumption of their own superiority. If one removed that assumption, then it was possible to learn many new things from other cultures. Shakespeare wrote plays that included non-European characters, most notably Othello, the Moor of Venice. His works suggested that he saw racial categorization as irrational and problematic. Father Bartolomeo de las Casas was a priest sent to the New World. He learned native languages and gave Mass in them. He also wrote essays claiming that Native Americans were the equals of all Europeans and that their lack of Christianity was not an excuse to treat them unfairly. He argued that until his death against slavery. De las Casas is representative of the complex nature of religious conversion missions to the New World. Because of competition in Europe between Protestants and Catholics during the Reformation, and because of the Spanish missionary zeal following their conquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Abbasid Caliphate, Europeans, both Protestant and Catholic, were interested in converting people outside of Europe to Catholicism. Still, Catholics were the first to discover that to do so required knowledge of the culture and language of those to be converted. So knowledge and ideas went both ways. Religious missionaries also introduced Western methods of agriculture to Native Americans and learned from them how to grow American crops, which made their way to Europe as part of the Columbian Exchange. In this sense, missionary activities spread American ideas to Europe as much as it spread Christianity and European ideas to the New World. The most important result of European exploration was the connection of the American continents to the world in terms of trade, politics, and culture. Eurasian trade globalization was taken to new levels as American products, African slaves, and American silver became part of the World Trade Network. This was not always positive, but it had the effect of changing all of the continents. Foods such as peppers, chocolate, peanuts, tomatoes entered food cultures throughout the world, changing Chinese, European, Japanese, Korean, Indian, and African cooking. Tobacco became a global product. Environments changed and disease profiles changed, as well as significant movement declines and increases in human populations changed the faces of continents. In many ways, these connections set the stage for changes that would make the modern world in both positive and negative senses.